Millennium 42. It is the Era Indomitus, Age of the Dark Imperium, and a violent warp storm known as the Cicatrix Maledictum has split the Milky Way galaxy in half. In its wake come the demonic hordes of chaos, spilling forth in a never-ending wave of violence and madness not seen for some 15,000 years. Cut off from the light of the Emperor, hopeless in the clutches of the Dark Gods, trillions wither and die on the vine, and the Imperium reels from within, pushed to its breaking point. But all is not lost. A Primarch has returned in this darkest of hours to lead humanity in its desperate struggle. Robot Girly Man and the Mary Sue Marines, equipped with new technology, the Rubicon Primaris, and a determined war machine, arrive to turn the tide. And of his brothers, Bobby G is probably the best choice to follow in the footsteps of the Emperor and reforge a kingdom on a galactic scale. He's done it before with Ultramar and the 500 Worlds, and Imperium Secundus, the Unremembered Empire. But this Dark Imperium is the timeline we will find ourselves, some unknown date in 2021. Darktide is coming. We have a bunch of new info about where it's headed in terms of design philosophy, setting, and possible future content. 2 guardsmen, a zealot, and an Ogren walk into a hive city. Nurgle poops his pants, and his minions are sent screaming back into the abyss. Sound like a fun time? Yeah, I'm pretty hyped too, and even more so after the devs over at Fat Shark HQ had a little chit chat with IGN. So the biggest piece of news that came out of this particular interview is that Darktide is going to be set right meow in the current modern era of 40k lore. That is to say, 9th edition. This is big news for a couple of reasons. Number one, when Fat Shark started making the first Vermintide, Warhammer Fantasy was still a thing, right? The world hadn't been blown up yet. All the characters, all the lore, all those 30 years of history were still very much present and alive in what they were creating. But by the end of its life cycle, stuff blew up, everybody died, and Warhammer Fantasy Battle was no longer an active IP. Fast forward to 2021, and Fat Shark are making the conscious decision to tackle current 40k. And this is brilliant. It's a really smart business decision because it positions them at the cutting edge of Games Workshop products for the foreseeable future. When new races, new units, new content, all that stuff is introduced, Darktide and its spin-offs will be there to capitalize on it. And unlike Vermintide, which is somewhat limited by the fact that its parent setting is, well, dead, Darktide will be set in the current lore, with the story still being written and the universe still being expanded upon. That opens up a lot of doors. We've already seen the synergistic relationship between video games and tabletop, novels, TV shows, comics, and other mediums. The Total War Warhammer series has been quite lucrative for both Games Workshop and Creative Assembly, but they haven't fully been able to capitalize on the synergy there because Warhammer Fantasy is dead. Sure, there are plenty of converts who have made the jump over to Age of Sigmar, people who never played tabletop before or had even heard of Warhammer before they got their hands on Total War, because there's still lots of crossover between the two settings, between Age of Sigmar and Warhammer Fantasy. Much of it is still recognizable, but it's not quite as symbiotic relationship as it could be, because if someone plays Total War and then says, oh my god, I want to go buy a Tomb King's army, well, joke's on you. Go suck a sandy bone chode, you wiener. You can't. You cannot play Tomb Kings on the tabletop anymore. But when it comes to Darktide and 40k, now that we know that this Poxwalker incursion in the hive city of Tertium is set in the present day lore, that was a conscious decision by Fat Shark to avoid the limiting factors of Vermintide setting, we have a much better picture of what the future might hold and how closely it will be tied to the route G-Dubs takes with the lore, which is to say, very close. And I know we're kind of already getting ahead of ourselves a bit, talking about what the future might hold for a game that we still don't know that much about yet, but not really, because this is the position Fat Shark is actively taking as we speak, that when Necrons, the Gene Stealer cults, the Tyranids, or the Orks get a massive push from Games Workshop, Darktide will be right there, walking hand in hand every step of the way. It's just a smart business decision here, whether they decide to do all that stuff or not. More on that in a little bit. But yeah, that kind of cross-promotion can be huge for companies. It has the potential to tremendously benefit their bottom lines. Now we know at this point that Age of the Dark Imperium is the setting, so what does that mean for our lucky ragtag band of inquisitorial operatives? Well, unfortunately for them, this is the age of Nurgle, Grandpapa Plague, who leads the spearhead assault against Bobby G and this new wave of Primaris in a cataclysmic conflict known as the Plague Wars at the outset of the Dark Imperium. This brutal war of attrition severely damages Ultramar and the Imperium at large, as thousands of planets are overcome by virus and plague, and trillions die. Atoma Prime, the setting for Darktide, is one such location, visited by the walking pox and all manner of terrors from the warp. Chaos marks us all. There is no escaping their legions. Their touch is everywhere at this point in 40k lore, and when it comes to enemy types, according to the devs, chaotic options are almost endless. From cultists to demons to traitor marines, the scale is enormous, says Anders de Geer, Darktide's game director, and this isn't really surprising news if you think about it. We previously talked about the upcoming Vermintide expansion in the Chaos Wastes and how it doesn't make any sense to set missions there if the demons of Nurgle aren't coming. You don't go to the Chaos Wastes to fight more Norscan marauders. You go there to fight demons. And how it doesn't make sense to make demons in Vermintide and not port those assets over to Darktide as well. But it is the first time the devs have explicitly mentioned them in regards to demons or traitor marines, something they'd be unlikely to talk about if they weren't on the agenda. And for many of us, I think demonic entities of Nurgle and the plotting advance of Chaos Space Marines might very well end up being a major highlight of this franchise. Now, I am not on the bandwagon that adheres perfectly to lore in all aspects. I've made that clear many times in the past. When you're making a video game, gameplay comes first. More enemy types, more classes, more weapons, more mechanics generally makes for a more entertaining game, even if you have to stretch that lore a teeny bit. Our characters are protagonists. This is a video game. They're gonna have plot armor. They are special. You can throw them to the wolves and test them with the numberless hordes of Nurgle, his cultists, throw disease and plague at them, throw demons at them, and they're going to come out on top. It's no different than if they were the main character of a 40k novel. They'll throw lots of grimdark at you, they'll make it clear how vile your enemy is, how brutally your friends will die, but you're the main character. You'll at least make it to the end. With that said, there is a different power scale present here in a setting like Vermintide than what we'd see in Warhammer Fantasy. An enemy like Plague Marines, for example, are a breed apart from content we saw in Vermintide. Yes, Chaos Warriors in Fantasy are hulking monsters in warp-forged armor, blessed by their dark gods, capable of inhuman feats, but they are not quite on the level of what a Death Guard Traitor Marine can do in 40k. That power armor, that strength, that speed, those plague-touched bolters firing 75 caliber rocket-propelled grenades, those bile spewers just spewing melting acid across the room, melting through bulkheads and anything it touches. It's a problem if you're a protagonist in Darktide, and something has to give. We're just guardsmen. We're just an Ogryn. Not exactly the uber elite cream of the crop when it comes to the Imperium's military might. Perhaps these won't live up to the lofty expectations we have for them in the lore when it comes to Plague Marines, which, to be fair, varies wildly in the source material depending on which novel you read or what you're playing on the tabletop. I mean, in some novels, a Space Marine is essentially an unkillable world ender. Put them in a squad and they can take a planet. But in other elements of the source material, a single well-placed plasma shot ends their existence for good. And we will have plenty of plasma to choose from in Darktide. So Fat Shark could make them a special in the way that Blightstormers and Leeches are in Vermintide, or they could make them a souped-up version of a Chaos Warrior with more HP, a powerful ranged weapon, and an aura of decay. If that's the route they pursue, then we'd be seeing multiple Traitor Marines a mission, and they'd be a tough enemy to slay, but they wouldn't be unkillable. We'd be killing 10 or 15 of them every run. Might not sit well with lore grognards, and to be honest, there are elements of me and myself and plenty of my viewers who are kind of that lore grognard, but at the same time, it worked in Vermintide, I think it can work here. I could very easily see Fat Shark taking that route, and even though it wouldn't perfectly reflect the lore in the same way that Sergeant Kruber easily manhandling dozens of Chaos Warriors does not perfectly reflect the lore, I wouldn't really have a problem with it. Good gameplay and enemy variety comes first, and then we can worry about the lore second. I think you guys get what I'm saying. But I think Plague Marines would be better served as mini-bosses like the Bile Trolls, Rat Ogres, and Chaos Spawn we have now. We already have a Plague Ogryn occupying one of those slots for Darktide. I would not mind seeing a Death Guard Traitor occupy the second. Or hell, you could even introduce a 3-man kill team as a mini-boss, where each Marine can take a ton of punishment and dish out a lot of damage before they finally drop. I think that's the perfect medium. They're not necessarily powerful enough to be a legit Chaos Sorcerer level boss, but they can certainly be on the level of a Rat Ogre, a Minotaur, a Storm Fiend, that kind of thing. And of course, there's a whole arsenal of equipment they could use, from blight grenades and death heads to rust-pitted plague axes, swarms of flies, and rotted bolters left over from the Horus Heresy. There's a lot of fun stuff Fat Shark could do when it comes to their weaponry and how they interact with the player. No matter how they're implemented, it's the probability of them and demons that has me most excited for Darktide, and I imagine Fat Shark will be waiting to unveil those until we get a little bit closer to launch. I don't think they want to blow their load too early, especially when a 2021 release date isn't even a guarantee. Things can always get delayed. Now, one of the really cool lines from this interview talks about how a chainsword won't play exactly like a falchion or a straight-edged weapon from Warhammer Fantasy. How they've designed it so that the teeth bite deep, having to work and saw and cut and hack until the flesh parts and the head finally comes free. We saw that in the gameplay trailer itself. That delay when hitting an enemy as a chainsword does its work. And it looks good. It looks satisfying. But I think there's a big question here, and it's that, how does that function when you've got 25 poxwalkers all in your face at once, swinging away? It's not a problem in Vermintide, because your weapons have cleave. They hit multiple enemies at once, and they don't get stuck, leaving you time and space to dodge dance and push the horde backwards in between decapitating strikes. That won't work so well when the teeth of your chainsword has to rip and tear its way through a single poxwalker neck. So retaining the gritty, visceral, satisfying feel of a chainsword, that unique feel, while letting players actually deal with the number of enemies we should expect in a horde game like this one, might be a tough balancing act. On the flip side, with ranged weapons, bolt guns are confirmed to be in the game, straight from the dev's mouth. But of course, not getting the Space Marine patterns here, because they'd probably just dislocate our dainty little shoulders, so we'll be seeing smaller, human-sized versions like the lock pattern bolter that you might expect a commissar to wield. Which means, shooting into that onrushing cultist horde, you're going to be seeing body parts hit the ceiling. Things will explode. That's going to be a good time. To quote Darktide's executive producer, we want to live up to people's expectations around weapons, but we also want to make sure that their favorite weapons are represented. So there's been a lot of work put into thinking, hey, is it okay if a guardsman can even have this? Because it's such a cool and iconic thing. We're really trying to do our best to make sure that people's favorite weapons are there and they make sense. And maybe some of them, you might have to squint your eyes a bit and say, maybe that's not the most realistic thing, but you're happy that you get to play with it. And for me personally, that is the exact right perspective. Yes, it might be unrealistic for our Sergeant-at-Arms to bust out an Inferno pistol, given how exceedingly rare they are in the lore, but immolating enemies with a weapon like that would be incredibly fun, and we've never seen anything like it in a 40k game before. I have no idea if Inferno pistols will be in the game, but you know what I mean. Bust out those rare, super unique weapons like Charonite claws that you'll never see in any other setting, in any other video game, and let us go hog wild with them. Even if a normal guardsman or ogre would be a bit unlikely to have them in the lore. And before I go, there was one very interesting mention when it came to the future of Darktide. Says Martin Wallen, the co-founder of Fat Shark, every single interview we talk about orcs, but it's not their time yet. At some point, they will matter, I promise you. I don't know when, but we see this as a long, continuous journey, so to speak, that we want to build over time. At some point, orcs will matter, I promise you. Well, game developer promises are not always kept, sometimes for reasons outside their control, sometimes not, so we can't take that as explicit confirmation, but these are very certain terms for Darktide and its future. Orcs are on the agenda. They're a faction they actively want to do some point later down the line. It's pretty exciting stuff, but it makes you wonder, how would they actually do it? One of the core issues moving forward, should they choose to tackle the Green Tide, is that the Orks aren't going to be teaming up with the forces of chaos. That's not a thing. It doesn't work that way. They can't send multiple factions at you in the same way they did in Vermintide. Vermintide is set in the end times. The Skaven and the forces of chaos and the Beastmen work together. That's not gonna fly here. You're not gonna be seeing orcs and chaos hordes team up. So Fat Shark would have to make an orc-themed expansion all its own, essentially creating adventure maps like Into the Nest, where orcs are the only enemy for that run. Or they'd have to create a system where parts of existing levels have orc ambushes separate from the main enemies. Because you can't have orcs and chaos on screen at once. They aren't gonna code for them fighting and killing each other. So it might end up having to be its very own game, like some sort of sequel, should Darktide prove to be a financial success. And I'd be super down for that. You're planet side during an invasion like the Third War for Armageddon. You're there when Feces hits the proverbial fan. You fight through wave after wave of Daka and Wa energy, and then the final set of missions kicks in, and you're infiltrating a crash-landed rock and taking on the prime orc war bosses leading that horde. The world is Fat Shark's oyster at this point. The future is limitless. The potential content is limitless, and I cannot wait to see what's coming. But first things first, get Chaos right, get Darktide right, get that 40k feel right, and from there, it should all fall into place, and we could be looking at a really interesting future. Check back for more Warhammer 40k Darktide news in the coming months, and here is to an awesome 2021 for gaming. Hope you guys enjoyed.